About ready to roll here for the first panel of the afternoon. Everybody still having a good time here at Howard Days? All right. So this is the gaming panel. How many people here have played any Howard-related game of any kind? Role-playing, video games, all right. Almost the whole room. I'm actually amazed that there's a few people that did not put up their hands. Maybe after this panel we'll change that. So I see some heads shaking. All right. So we're gonna kick this off, and I'm gonna let everyone introduce themselves as we go through this, and we're gonna talk about some of the history of Howard Gaming, and by gaming we're including role-playing games, board games, video games, any sort of experience where you're playing in the world of Robert E. Howard. So let's start off at the end with Jason.
Yeah, so I'm Jason Carney. I am an English professor at Christopher Newport University. I've written on Howard. As far as gaming is concerned, I've been playing Dungeons & Dragons since 1992. That doesn't seem like it was that long ago, I guess. But long story short, my experience with Dungeons & Dragons and love of Robert E. Howard, they kind of go hand in hand. But I'll say more about my gaming experience, because a lot of the games that have come out as Robert E. Howard Conan-inspired games have been really crappy. But I'll try not to curse during the panel.
My name is Fredrik Malmberg. I was originally born in rural Sweden, which I refer to as Cimmeria. And I am an old-timer, so I grew up on war games, the hexagon-shaped battle games, and I published my first game called Fight for Tobruk in 1974. I was 12 years old, and it was in English, and I printed 1,000 copies. I think I still have 960 or so.
Did you bring them with you?
What's that again?
Did you bring them with you?
I could. Yeah. So, long story short, I came in contact with role-playing games. I think this was in 1977, maybe, playing Dungeons & Dragons at a Swedish role-playing, or a Swedish game convention. And at the time, I had started doing a little bit of selling of my games and importing and stuff. And I had the fortune that led me, as a 17-year-old, I ended up in the basement of what's called Chaosium, and tested the first edition of Call of Cthulhu, together with Sandy Peterson and Charlie Crank and Greg Stafford and the fine people over at Chaosium, and that really shaped my experience with role-playing games. And I went back to Sweden, and the first Swedish role-playing games were published by my company. Today I run a company called Cabinet Entertainment. It's my company. We do everything: consumer products, film, television, publishing, financing of such things, and we own Conan properties. So we're very happy to be here, and gaming is sort of part of our DNA.
All right. I'm Jeff Shanks. I'm a archaeologist and Howard scholar, but I've been a gamer since I was 9 years old as well. My start was, it was 81 with the D&D Red Box basic set, right when it came out. I'd seen an article in Dynamite Magazine. I don't know if any of you guys remember that, from Scholastic. They came out. You remember there, somebody that had a little write-up on D&D, and so instantly I had to have it, and got that basic set, and I was played all my life ever since. More recently, I've been the Howard content advisor. Been doing a lot of art directing for the Modifius role-playing game, which has been quite an experience the last couple of years, and doing things to try and help create a Conan role-playing game that really captures the feel of Howard. Conan's been a part of role-playing, from the very beginning, and there have been a number of iterations over the years. The TSR Conan and was it the GURPS one back in the, it was, yeah, and Mongoose, of course, was a biggie. But we really wanted to try and do something special with the new one, and with Robert E. Howard's Conan is the name of the game itself. Howard's name comes first, and that's how we approached the design of the game, and that's something I'll talk about more later. But next.
My name's Steve Booth. I work with Fred and Jay at Cabinet Entertainment. My first experience with role-playing was Chainmail. I don't know if everyone remembers the silver.
Right on.
And through that, I've gone through, played the first Pong games when they came out in the arcades, role-playing, GURPS, like you say, Dungeons and Dragons, all that kind of stuff, and then video gaming. And I really wanted to do that as my life's work, so I went into the Hollywood studios and worked at Universal and Paramount and the Jim Henson Company, doing interactive licensing, playtesting games, and it was the best thing ever. So, and now I'm here at Cabinet doing the same kind of a thing. So your dreams can come true, and I'll be running the slideshow for all of us. So if anything happens, it's me.
Excellent. I'm Bill Cavalier, and I've been a Robert E. Howard fan since 1966. And in 1978, I was in my office at Sears Roebuck and Company, and my friend Richard Polka came in the door, and he said to me, "Hey, I think I'd known him for a while. We played games together." He says, "I think I found a game that you might like." He knew of my affection for Robert E. Howard, and he said, "It's called Dungeons and Dragons." And all right, so I went over and I started to play with, and from the very get-go, here was a game that I could pretend to be Conan. How cool was that? And it was all over after that, and I've been playing Dungeons and Dragons since 1978, and I haven't looked back. And one of the things I'm going to talk about is how Robert E. Howard influenced the creation of Dungeons and Dragons.
All right. Well, let's start with some of that early history. You brought it up. Maybe why don't you tell us that story a
That'd
little
be
bit?
fine,
You've
yeah.
talked with Gary himself about this.
I have,
right?
yeah.
Let's hear about that.
I've been attending Gen Con, which is the big gaming convention, consecutively since 1980. I've been to 39 consecutive. This will be 39 consecutive Gen Cons that I've been to. Early on, the first Gen Con I went to was in 1980. And Gary Gygax, who was the co-creator of Dungeons and Dragons, he was pretty accessible then. He would walk amongst the fans. It was maybe 2,500 fans that would show up for Gen Con. So he'd walk around and chat with anybody who wanted to. And I knew he was a fan of Robert E. Howard, so that was my approach. And we sat down and we talked for about 30 minutes. And my focus was, Howard's influence on the creation of Dungeons and Dragons, and he readily agreed to that. And he said, "I've been a fan of Robert E. Howard all my life." In a print interview, he talked about how he read The Hour of the Dragon, the known press edition, and how it changed the way he thought about fantasy. And so early on, Howard was shaping the creation of Gary's game, and he was very accessible. I talked to him the next year about pretty much the same stuff, and he readily admitted that he had read everything that Robert E. Howard ever wrote, and he loved Howard and how important Howard was to him. Then later on in 1995, I had a chance to talk with Dave Arneson, who is the co-creator of Dungeons and Dragons along with Gary Gygax. And I was a little more pointed in my questions to him. So I asked him, I got to talk to him after his panel, and I asked him specifically, how did Robert E. Howard help you create Dungeons and Dragons? He said, well, I was sitting around one time, it was one weekend, and I was watching Godzilla movies, and I was eating popcorn, and I was doodling on some graph paper, and I read about 6 Conan books. Well, this would have been in the early 1970s, so it would have been the Lancer editions. And he said, well, I thought the Conan books were all pretty much the same. And I asked him, well, what specifically helped you create Dungeons and Dragons? He says, well, it was, I have to read my quote here. It was where did I write it down? It was the hero killing critters and stealing treasure. That was Howard's influence on Dungeons and Dragons. If you ever played Dungeons and Dragons, you kill critters, and you steal treasure. There you have it. And so that was my early experience with it. And as it went on, Gary wrote quite extensively on Howard's influence. Howard was a huge influence, not nearly as much as Tolkien was, and so we're grateful that Mr. Gygax was a Howard fan, and that Robert E. Howard helped him create Dungeons and Dragons. And Dungeons and Dragons, of course, was the original role-playing game, and it took off from there, and here we are.
A lot of people don't remember the first, does anybody know where the first, I know you know, the first appearance of any kind of Howard material in Dungeons and Dragons? I know you know where that was. Anyone know that?
The source book about the gods. Right?
Yeah, the original, before Deities and Demigods,
Okay.
the original.
Yeah,
the original,
Appendix N.
In OD&D, in the old box set, it was the, Appendix
Yeah,
N. And
well, yeah,
before
yeah.
that,
The original edition of Dungeons and Dragons was
the old box set.
3 white books in a hand-covered. It was hand-covered with contact paper.
Yeah.
It was a wood pattern, and that was in 1974 when those first came out.
And then they started releasing supplements to them, and one of those supplements was a Gods, what was it, Gods, Myths?
Demigods and deities.
No, before
Yeah.
that. It's prior to that. This was the prototype for what became Deities and Demigods. And it included Hyborian deities in there. They had Crom, and they had all of this, and it was, you know, yeah, it was very pastiche. It was all, you know, coming out of the Lancers, and so it had a lot of the material from, you know, that Len Carter and DeCamp added to it. But that was the first one. They took it out of it. It was probably right about the time that CPI was being formed, and so they probably, you know, when they came out with Deities and Demigods a few years later, the hardback, they left out the Conan stuff, and of course they included the Cthulhu stuff, you know, and had some issues with Chaosium, you know, early on there. But you know, even officially, Conan was in there in the very first version of Dungeons and Dragons.
He was, yeah. There was a mention of Conan in the introduction. Gygax wrote about some of the influences on the creation of Dungeons and Dragons, and Howard, of course, was listed along with. There were 7 prominent authors. Edgar Rice Burroughs, of course, John Carter of Mars, and he made the quote about if you've never thrilled to the adventures of Howard's Conan, then you won't get Dungeons and Dragons, and that pretty much.
So why don't we, Jason, you put together a cool slideshow here of some of the early iterations of Conan role-playing games. Let's run through some of these.
I'm pretty sure these were the first modules for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons that featured Conan specifically, and they were part of the promotion of the movies. And I think what's really interesting about these modules is they had supplemental rules. So you had these things called luck points. I think every player character had 2 luck points, and you could spend a luck point to do all sorts of things. And my favorite was that you could kill any human, you know, at all, right? So like as Dungeon Master, when you're playing and you know your players have like 2, you know, insta kills, like it changes the dynamic, and you could even the big baddie at the end of the game can be killed with one of the luck points. And then it also included something called fear factor. So monsters, you just couldn't charge in and attack them. You could be, you know, run away screaming. I mean, I'm sure there were like something like savings throws in the earlier game that might have to do with like a certain creature inspires fear. But I think it's interesting how both of these new rules kind of brought in, or at least it was an attempt to bring in a Howardian, you know, atmosphere.
Oh, yeah.
This was maybe I don't know much about this, but I know TSR in 1985. This didn't have anything with the movie. Created an independent role-playing game, and the rule book was only 32 pages long, so it wasn't Dungeons and Dragons. It was something else. But I don't have. I just thought I thought maybe you guys would know about this.
Yeah, it had its own rule set. I played it once back in the day, and I don't remember. It's been so long. Do you remember, Mark?
It's the same engine that Marvel superheroes use.
Right, that's right. With
Yeah.
the percentile.
It was Dave
Right.
Zeb Cook's amazing engine.
Yeah.
And it had a rule book that was written by Howard Robert Earthen. They did something to convolute Howard's name, but
The war book was documented author. So, yeah. There's some fun stuff in it, but I think everybody was really bummed it wasn't D&D.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
These are just when they released the game, they released 3 modules to go along with it that you purchase separately. So I was reading about them online, and apparently the stories were really crappy. So I think one of the Robert Jordan novels is Conan Triumphant. That's the. Oh my gosh, this game. You guys play
We're
this
getting to
game?
video games here a little bit.
This was, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this game at all, but it was horrible. It was a side scroller. You could barely get Conan to move across, I think you had to tap the B button to get him to move. I have no idea. I rented it, and it was a waste of $1.50, and I went back.
Do you play with partners?
It was a single player game.
Pardon?
It was a single player game.
Oh, too bad.
Yeah.
Love hunting that so.
Yeah. I never played this. My parents we were poor, so I couldn't have a DOS computer, but I had a friend, and we couldn't get it installed. This was like 1992. But I don't know, anybody experiences with this one?
I've played it.
Yep.
It's entirely unmemorable.
Cheryl, you played this, didn't you? Is this the one you played?
And I agree, I remember this screenshot, but I remember absolutely nothing about the journey, the task.
It basically seemed like a bad reskin of Golden Axe that just sucked.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And of course, Golden Axe was the one barbarian character was kind of a coded knockoff of that as well.
It looks quest books.
These were basically this was for the Dungeons and Dragons kid who didn't have any friends who would play Dungeons and Dragons with them. They were I read a lot of these books. They were like choose your own adventures, but there were some basic rules. You'd use a random number tab in the back. There's one I couldn't find that featured a young Conan. I don't know if you guys remember that. There was an endless quest, and you were young Conan, and you were protecting one of your fellow Sumerian villagers. So it was interesting.
These things are going for like $50 on eBay now.
Yeah. I put this up here because this game was awesome in 1992, and I was only 10 years old, so I thought this was Conan, right? When I purchased the game, but it's obviously an homage.
Right.
Yeah. And this game was equally as bad as the first one. This was just a complete waste of money. They had a lot of cool little toys in there, but obviously that's a Conan homage, I think. Yeah.
There is one before this, actually.
Oh, there is?
Yeah, the
there is
MMO.
one. Yeah, no, yeah, the MMO, but no, the MMO is after, but there is one from TDK,
Oh, okay. I don't remember that one.
2003 or 4.
You got it? Yes. You got
Oh,
it?
the rules of
Yep.
Can one thing about this was there were some, even though the game sucked, excuse me, I'm sorry, I didn't use that word. There were some awesome finishing moves. Like there's a point in the game where as you're killing the monster, it would say start pressing this button over and over again. It was really hard to get the finishing move, but when you did get the finishing move, it was just glorious and beautiful.
Fred's got a story about this.
Yeah, I got a little story on this one, and the TDK one I mentioned before. We had just taken over CPI in 2002, and at the time there were absolutely no licenses that we had to work with. So I was on a worldwide trek to find partners, and coming from the gaming world, one of the buzzword now is gamification. And we felt that the character had been overexploited. It was too much Arnold stuff out there. And then we decided we should really push the world and the Hyborian Age and the whole Howard universe. So one of the first licenses we got was Funcom, who started working on an MMO in the style of EverQuest or Warcraft. But we inherited one deal that was the Conan 2004 TDK. This was a huge problem because it was they had an option. This company was owned by Infogram, and we bought everything in 2002, and it was the German boss who really was a huge Arnold fan and a big bodybuilder, and he says, we have the Conan license, we will make the Conan game. And we're looking, it's like, okay, that's fine. And the game is literally the Conan the Barbarian movie. It starts with, you come to your village, everything is burned down. You have to avenge your family and clan. And we're looking at it like, this is exactly everything we want to move away from. So we tried to, say, how can we get out of this deal? We don't want to have this be the first, approach to Conan fandom. But it was a watertight contract. But then they started, as most video game companies, they started slipping on the deadline. So like, oh, we need an extension. Okay, well then you have to cut away all the future game releases because they had a perpetual rolling license. Okay, and then of course 3 months later, we need another extension. Okay, but then you cut all the future titles to only this one and only released in Europe. Okay. And eventually it was so shriveled down that I think it was only released in like 4 or 5 countries, and it's really bad. But it is literally Conan the Barbarian, the movie. And when it comes to the game you showed from Nihilistic, that had really great potential actually, because we were working with THQ at the time, big Conan fans. And they were going to do a really great Conan game based on the Howard stuff. And they were going to take the Nihilistic studio up in San Francisco. I can't remember which game they had done before that, but they were pretty hot. And THQ said, we'll spend $20 million on this game, which was a huge sum in 2005. So we're very happy. Lo and behold, 6 months later, they changed the leadership. And the new leadership, the new management saying, oh, well, we don't want to pay royalties, so we should call, this is not really Conan, it's the Barbarian. And we went into one of those battles. And afterwards we know they were trying to get out of the deal because Funcom had just announced their MMO. They felt that, oh, we're kind of missing the beat here. We want to be the big guys. They had been delayed. They told the studio, rip out everything that's Howard on the Conan game, because they still had invested maybe half of that $20 million. This is what we've heard after. And then they decided to, after they realized that you can't, this is Conan, you can't come in, do a deal, and then release the same game, and especially on the heels of Funcom's MMO. Then they decided, okay, just finish the game. And then it was only 3 months until the Funcom game would hit. So all of a sudden they just scrambled to the finish, which is really sad because the game had a very big potential. So we were sorry to see that happen, but that's the background story.
So, but just to talk about while I was looking at the image, so, has anyone here, who all here has played the Age of Conan MMO? So some people have played this. So, this was a game, for me, coming in, finally getting some Howardian material. You start out in Tortage, the pirate city, and you get to explore it for the first time. It's a shipwreck on the beach, and you wash up, and you start interacting with characters, Sancha, and some of the other characters from the novels. And, for me as a fan coming into this game, it really was like, God, this is what I've been waiting for, finally. I'm all of a sudden fighting the black ones and giant apes, and it's this field. And now, finally, I'm getting to play the game that feels like the Hyborian Age. How did that come about, and how did you get Funcom to do this?
Well, when we acquired the characters, that was, of course, as I said, one of the first missions we had was to really get the world out there the right way. And then video games is probably the best way to do it, and maintaining control and not go to the Hollywood studio. So we went around, we talked to Sony Online at the time. We were down the rabbit hole. It wasn't the rabbit hole, but we were in pretty long, extensive negotiations with a group called Castle Hill, which consisted of a bunch of the Iron Crown Enterprises people, friends of mine, Pete Fenlon, There was a bunch of guys who came out of the role-playing world like myself, and they wanted to do an MMO. But then comes this Norwegian company, Funcom, and they had success with a game called Anarchy Online. But it failed on release. It was so buggy and it crashed. The concept was great, but they stuck with it. And as all gamers know, games can be buggy, but then you want to make sure that the publisher sticks with it and just makes it right. And they had done that. So they had a great. I thought that was a great kudos to them. Plus, I don't know how many of you have been to Norway, but Norway, if Sweden is Cimmeria, Norway is kind of like Nordheim. And those guys, they believe they are Vanir and Aesir, and they think that, they live in Conan's world. So that is the only country where the Marvel Conan comics, for instance, had been published continuously and never ever stopped. Because it was The Phantom was the comic book number 1, and Conan comic book number 2. So they came in and just basically we decided we should probably stick with these Norwegians as opposed to the Sony group. And then what happened, it was going to be a 2-year development cycle. They were going to release it in 2005. And then World of Warcraft came out. And everybody goes, oh shit, we can't, because the only thing before that was EverQuest 2 or Meridian, the competition was, but the bar was just raised so high, so they decided, okay, now we have to raise $40 million and go public, and that whole thing. And that raises another bag of issues. But they did release the game in 2008. They shipped over 1 million units, which doesn't say much to you if you're not in the gaming, but for an independent game company at the time, that was a very, very big number on PC. And I'm happy to report that this is now 10 years later, and they did a little promotion. Nobody has worked and developed this game. They maintain it and they support it, but nobody has really developed anything for 10 years. So they decided last year, maybe we should try to see if we can get a little new server where everybody starts from the beginning again. So they did another launch, and to big success, and tripled the amount of monthly players. So it's still up there after 10 years. The business model of the classic MMOs has sort of faded away. People don't want to pay the monthly subscription cost. So it's a dated business model, but the game is really good.
It's probably fair to say too. I mean, let's go back to that 1 million units, right? 1 million people, bought into this game. That's probably when that game came out. I think most of us here who are book fans and probably and other things maybe not realize that that's probably the most exposure that the character of Conan had probably since the Arnold movies, really. Yeah. If you think about it. I mean, the Dark Horse had, relaunched the comic, but at the most, what was it? So the highest issues, the circulation was probably 50,000 or so, maybe 60. 82, right? When it first started, but 82 compared to 1 million, right? And that was Dark Horse relaunching the comics. So it had been a long time since Conan had this kind of exposure. I think with this Funcom game, that really helped get it back out there in popular culture. Does anybody remember the reference in Big Bang Theory? They had the whole Age of Conan episode in Big Bang Theory, at the time.
Penny got hooked on it and didn't take a bath for 3 weeks.
Makes sense.
So we're in the 2000s here. We kind of skipped through, we jumped over to video games. We missed talking about, going back to the role-playing games for a second. During this period is when the Mongoose role-playing game came about. Now, did that start right after you guys took over the license? Okay, so that was your doing, right, with Mongoose. How many people here have played the Mongoose role-playing game? You played that, Andy? What are your thoughts on that? Let's get your...
A little bit. Well, I liked it because of all the detail.
Yeah.
I mean, the entire world was, you could buy supplements for all the different areas, and the character development was pretty good, I thought, and it was a nice system, and it was kind of true to Howard, and they had a lot of good stuff. But Vince Darlage did a bang up job on all the stuff that he did for for the Mongoose company. Well, that's good.
Yeah, no, it was based
Yeah.
on the D20 system, which was really popular at the time. That was kind of a universal system, that everyone was using in the early 2000s, and it was a good game. It was a fun game. It was, certainly the best Conan game, role-playing game, I think, up to that point. I'm a little biased now since I've been working on the Modiphius game, but tell us a little bit about the development of that.
Of the Mongoose game, it was around the same time as we were working with the Norwegians at Funcom, so we put them in touch with each other, and I believe there was an embedded team actually that collaborated on the research of these, because a lot of these territories and lands that you needed for the big game, of course, there was nothing in Howard. So we had the same challenges you have faced on your role-playing games, like, well, then what do you do? And you phrase it elegantly. So you go to the source material, which is basically what Howard was influenced by. So they were a very big help I believe a lot in collaboration between partners to get the same look and a uniform, more than slapping a big Bible of this is how it has to look or else. That doesn't work, because gaming comes out of, just like actually film and TV, but more so in gaming even, I think, comes out of passion. You have to have passion for whatever game you're designing, or you'll see it in the halls of Volta, whatever it was called. Clearly, somebody just skinned another game.
Jason, you remember the Mongoose game?
No. I was kind of a D&D. I was an anti-D20 person.
Oh, yeah.
I know it's the second edition, which is weird because that's usually not the one that people hew
Right.
to, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So let's bring it up to the modern day. In the last few years, where we
Well,
had,
I have one more comment about the Mongoose game. In the first edition, role-playing, the role-playing player's guide, I'm sorry. First edition role-playing player's guide, there were great props and much thanks given to REHUPA, the Robert E. Howard United Press Association. It's in the little blurb on the bottom of the page. And at that time, Dale Ripke, who was one of the all-time greats in the entire Howard chronology, he was given props there too. But and they mentioned this specifically because it was REHUPA. So the REHUPA web has spread far.
Oh, can I say one thing about the Age of Conan? I don't know if you've heard it, but the soundtrack of the Age of Conan MMORPG is amazing. Like it's absolutely beautiful. So look it up on YouTube. If you haven't played the game.
I actually use that soundtrack sometimes when I'm playing tabletop.
Really?
Playing games as background music. Yeah. So getting us up to the modern day, we're now sort of in the middle of really a Howard gaming renaissance, and I think it kind of started with the Monolith board game a few years back. And
What's one before? Age of Conan.
oh, that's right, the board game, the strategy game.
That on the picture? You
Yep. Yeah, that was a great game. It was sort of getting to play Risk in the Hyborian Age, and that was a great strategy game that came out. What year was that? Probably 2010, 11, something like that, 12 maybe?
8.
Oh, wow, man, I've lost time here. That was a great strategy game. But the Monolith game was really took off and blew away everyone. Patrice Lunet was advisor on that one, and you should probably be up here to talk about that, right? It was at the time the Kickstarter for that was ended up being the highest ranked Kickstarter. It raised more funds, 3.5 million.
3.5, and then when the last manager ended, it was around 4 million, 4.6 million, something like that.
It was the largest Kickstarter for a board game ever in history. And one of the things that made this game really stand out from some of the previous games, which many of the previous games had Howardian content and all of that, but in this game it really marketed the fact that it was going to be pure Howard Conan and nothing else. No pastiche, just strictly Conan. I don't know that it always ended up that way, but that was at least the original intent.
Yeah, it was mostly good, except in the end, it was because they did extension, and we keep, reaching stretch goal after stretch goal, and in the end, we simply didn't have any material to hand, so it was a bit.
Yeah, so
But mostly it was, yeah.
And I think that's really the first time that had really, where Howard, making it, using that sort of marketing strategy that this is Howard's Conan, this is, the real original Conan, was used in that way, and I really think that was a large part of the game's success. What do you think?
On the French forum, I don't know about the States, but on the French forums, it was just crazy, pure craziness. It was amazing, and the guys on forums kept asking questions. Oh, should I read the stories? Which story should I begin with? And at the end of the placement of the Kickstarter campaign, those guys had made a T-shirt for me, and it was Louinet approved. They gave that to me. It was just fun. I mean, I really had a great time.
The game designers must have hated you, didn't they?
Sorry?
The game designers must have hated you by the end of it.
Yeah.
So, but it worked, right? This was, it really did. And, this is coming on the heels of, getting the real text out, which you guys were instrumental in doing, the unedited Howard text. So there was already this kind of, idea out there, at least in fantasy fan circles and all, that, there are sort of two different versions of Conan and the other characters. There's Howard's version, and then there's the version that we've gotten for the last few decades with other, pastiche material mixed in. And so this was really one of the first products that really tried to separate Howard's Conan from all of the later pastiche material, and it worked. I mean, clearly there were fans that were into that. On the heels of it came a new role-playing game about a year later. This is the Modifius role-playing game. That's what I was involved in. And, I think that they saw really, the success of the Monolith game and this idea of let's stick to Howard's Conan. And when I was approached very early on about being an advisor for it, and, that was they asked me right off the bat, how do we get that across too, that this is going to be, this Conan game is going to be, we're going to stick to Howard's Conan as much as we can. And, well, why don't you call it Robert E. Howard's Conan? Yeah, that's great, right? So, I mean, that's simple, but it's part of it, right? You have Robert E. Howard's name in there. Robert E. Howard's Conan. It's like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or Bram Stoker's Dracula, right? It's going back to those literary roots and giving it that authenticity. And Adventures in an Age Undreamed Of is the subtitle. And so, again, it was, I couldn't even pitch that idea, like, let's keep this Howardian, if it hadn't been for Monolith paving the way, and they saw those, the results there, the math checks out. People really want a Howardian Conan. And the Modifius role-playing game ended up being the fourth highest role-playing game Kickstarter. At the time. It would have done better, but it actually got launched at the same time as another really, really popular RPG that kind of dampened it a little bit. It probably would have done better, but it was number 4 of all time. So again, yeah.
There's a cull sort or connection with the Conan game as well.
Yes, there's going to be a cull supplement. They're working on that right now. But the idea too was to come up with how do you play a role-playing game? We had the Mongoose game that at least it had all the lore, it had all, here's a list of all the countries, here's a list of all of this, it had all of that, but how do you play a role-playing game and make it feel like you're actually immersed in a Howard story? And the way, and this is where I kind of, what I suggested they do, and I came up with this, and I'm not a game designer. I've played a lot of role-playing games, but I'm not a designer, but I kind of came up with this idea, well, think about, instead of having supplements that just list a country, here's the supplement for Aquilonia, here's the supplement for Stygia, with all of the things in there. You look at that, the Conan stories themselves, they're all very different types of stories, right? They're different genres, really. We think of them as sword and sorcery, but really, this is a pirate story with a weird element. This is a frontier story with a weird element. So look at the types of genres and do supplements that tell you how to play along those lines. So we had, here's the Conan the Thief supplement that, here's how you play a thief story in the mall in Zamora, and it should feel like a caper or heist movie. That's going to be the kind of feel for it. If it's with Conan the Pirate, you're playing more of a swashbuckling type adventure story. And so the idea was to come up with, rules for the GM that would create the feel of that type of story. So you're really immersed in more of a literary environment. And so it was kind of a unique approach, I think, and amazingly the guys went along with that and found a way to make it work. And so that's was the approach that we took to it. And it's having played it, it was great. One of the first play tests we had was actually right here in the Howard House a couple of years ago here at Howard Days. Sitting at Robert E. Howard's dining room table, we did the first official play test, and it was a pretty amazing thing. You look back at some of the pictures of Howard, playing, and he was doing cosplay and fighting with swords with his friends and stuff. He lived in an era before role-playing games, but I think he would have been a gamer like us. I think if he had the ability to do that, that's to be able to immerse yourself in these worlds that he created, and that's one of the cool things about games, I think. So that was a cool experience for me. We've got new games now. Conan Exiles. Let's talk about that. That's just launched.
That's just launched. What do we have, Steve? So this was another game from from our Norwegian friends. They've now spent 15 years working in this world. So of course they've amassed an amazing know-how and an amazing art base and an amazing tech base. But for various reasons, they were up Schitt's Creek because they had spent all the money from the success of the Conan game on a Lego MMO and a couple of other strange games. So they changed all the management. They had no money in the bank account anymore, and some smart guy there said, "We have to do a Conan game again." That was very clever. So they came over, and this was really a team of skilled people, but very damaged people, and they had really pinpointed a category of game coming up called survival games. And I don't know if you've heard of Ark or Rust, and this is basically when you're plopped down with nothing, and you have to start harvesting little sticks and stones and build your hut and build a fire and kill a hyena and eat it, but don't eat it raw, that's bad for you, and so forth and so on. So these games were sandbox games that just cost very little to make, but they had to be good games. And this team then performed what's called an early access launch, very risky, but they had no alternative. They had money to survive for 6 months, so they were really it was like a Conan story. But we knew these guys, and we owed it to them. We had worked with them for many, many years. They had a sound plan. So we said, we trust you guys. We worked very closely with them, and 6 months later, they announced, they did a beautiful CG trailer. For me, personally, that's the best Conan ever. If you go online and you just click for Conan Exiles cinematic trailer, it's such a badass Conan that I get goosebumps just thinking about it. It's no actor, it's a CG trailer. No, but it's done by other friends of ours, and
He really does.
yeah, and Tom Olson, who's the creative director of Goodbye Kansas, the studio behind these great trailers that we do. He started as 14 years old in our game store. He was and of course he's the biggest Conan fan ever, right? So he art directed it with one of J.J. Abrams' really great concept artists, and who was the director. And that really pulled the game on the map because people really saw that trailer. It got millions of shares, and the game launched in early access. And this is last year. This year, about a month ago, it was released out of early access. So now it's finished. And they're up to 1.4 million sold units. People love the game. We've had some real great celebrity players like Jim Howard, related. Distant cousin of Bob, and it's a great game. You just basically there was also a great PR campaign attached with it that helped.
Yeah, it was the trailer was great. I was fortunate. Mark Finn and I were fortunate to appear with Joel, one of the designers. We did an early walkthrough. We had some early access and got to look at some of the early stuff. I guess that was about a year ago. and yeah, very cool stuff.
Yeah.
So, and it's blown up.
Yeah.
It's how many units did you say already?
it's-
What, 4 million? Something like
No,
that?
1.4.
1.4,
But
right.
it's just.
But that's this past week,
Yeah.
pretty much, effectively, you know. So this is a huge success. So I know there's going to be some things coming up on the horizon. We can save that for the next panel. Why don't we go to the audience for some questions? Questions on Conan Gaming. Oh, there's a lot. Bobby.
More of a comment.
Sure.
There's a couple of odds and ends in the role-playing things you guys didn't touch on.
Yeah.
They had a couple of red Sony supplements.
Yep, that's true.
They had GURPS Conan, which
Yep.
they got Ellsbury Camp to do the intro for that for some reason. Savage Worlds of Solomon Kane.
Yeah, that's right. We skipped over Savage. Yeah, which is a great game that used what is it?
Savage Worlds,
the
yeah.
Savage Worlds engine for that, which is a really great pulpy engine, you know, for playing pulp style role playing games.
Do you have the Solomon Kane video?
I do, should we have?
Oh yeah, let's show that. Yeah, let's show that.
The question was if there were any other video games based on Solomon Kane or any other characters. We can talk a little bit about that next in the next panel. But yes, there's an El Barak game that's being in the works. There is 2 Conan games, one from a studio called Petroglyph. They used to be known as Westwood in Las Vegas. They are famous for games like Command and Conquer, Red Alert, and they've done some Star Wars RTS games. So they are working on a Conan game for release next spring or next year, first half of the year. And the other Conan game is by the same team in Oslo that did Conan Exiles. So that's a big team. That's the massive team. And then we have one more Solomon Kane game in the works, actually.
Okay.
Also, another good thing is in this Conan Exiles game is it's fully moddable. So, I mean, if you want to get into Unreal and like dig into it, you can make your own Solomon Kane game.
True.
Okay. Speaking of Solomon Kane. There we go. Good. Fire. Real quick, because we run out of time. Tell us about the Kickstarter.
So the Kickstarter goes live on the 12th at 9 p.m. French time, which would be around 2 p.m. Texas time. The campaign will last 3 weeks only, meaning it will end on July the 5th. The core board game should be around $110. The all-in will be about triple that, so it would be $330. It will have 120 different characters. That means 180 figurines. It's going to be, and the illustration will all be in there. What can I tell you? It's a cooperative game. I've played an early version of the game. It's just, I love it. It's really good, and you are really immersed in the actor of your stories. And the figurines, the quality is amazing. I sound like a bit like a salesman here, and obviously I can't be judge and jury, but I would be working on the project if I didn't believe in it. That's what I do, and it's really good. Trust me on that.
Cool. All right. Well, we're about to run out of time. Let's get one more question. Anyone? Yeah.
So you were talking about role playing, and I've never been a role player, but one of the things that I noticed through the 80s and the 90s, there's a couple of books out there called Satanic Panic.
Yeah.
And the stigma that put on role playing game, and then how over the years has kind of survived. So what were your experiences kind of surviving that and promoting coding for that kind of stigma?
Can I tell a stupid story? So I had all the AD&D second edition books, and my mom said, those are devil worshipping, and I'll buy them, from you for $100 each. I only paid $20 each for them, and so of course, and then I immediately went and bought 3 other copies of them. The actor shooed them away. So, and then I brought a lot of campaign setting material and all that stuff. So.
Well, I had a woman tell me that I was going to hell because I played Dungeons and Dragons, and to keep it away from children, and I didn't listen to her.
I went to a Christian school for a few years, and I made sure to bring my D&D stuff to school all the time and play at lunch. Oh, I was a rabble rouser and a troublemaker. I rubbed their face in it, and I didn't care. Fortunately, I had parents that were supportive and let me do that and realize that was just nonsense. Real quick, last minute. Yeah.
I was wondering if there's going to be any early bird bonuses on the Kickstarter.
That's a good question. That's an excellent question. Yes, there will be a bonus, especially if you like one story. I'm not going to tell you which one, but yes, there will be one. Thank you. That's a very interesting question.
All right.